fashion designers spend careers trying to create a single look that people remember. Michael Jackson created dozens of them, and the more you understand how each one was actually built, the more extraordinary the whole enterprise becomes. The wardrobe was not assembled by a team of stylists pulling from existing collections. It was invented from scratch, piece by piece, by two men named Michael Bush and Dennis Tompkins over 25 years of work that blurred the boundary between costume design, engineering, and fine craft. They taught themselves metalworking, electronics, exotic leather techniques, and zipper repair at 2 a.m. after shows. Because what Jackson asked them to build had no instruction manual. The result was a visual language so coherent and so specific that even fragmentary elements of it, a single glove, a tilted fedora, a red leather shoulder, communicate instantly across cultures and generations without context. That does not happen by accident. It happens through a philosophy of design that was applied consistently, rigorously, and with an ambition that most artists would have found paralyzing. Here is a question to hold while we go through what that wardrobe actually contained and how it was made. When you think about a performer's visual identity, do you think of it as costume, as fashion, or as something else entirely? Because what Michael Bush described as a guiding principle suggests a third category. One that has more in common with architecture than either of the first two. Let us look at what was inside that closet. The philosophy before the fabric. Michael Bush encapsulated the design approach in a phrase that sounds like an oxymoron until you look at the actual costumes it produced. Liberace goes to war. Liberace represented the furthest possible reach of performative excess, elaborate crystal-encrusted garments, fur collars, piano-shaped jewelry. Costumes so theatrical they became the show rather than part of it. Military uniforms represented the opposite end of the spectrum, structured authority, earned rank expressed through precise ornamentation. The weight of institutional power expressed in braid and metal and cut. The synthesis of those two impulses produced the silhouette that became globally synonymous with one performer. The broad-shouldered military jacket, covered in crystals, metals, and embroidery that bore no relationship to any actual military rank, combined the visual authority of command with the unapologetic spectacle of theatrical excess. It was a costume that declared its own rules while appearing to invoke a tradition. Jackson told Bush that a uniform commands attention. He had been drawn since childhood to the Disney conception of the knight in shining armor, the fairy tale monarch in full regalia. And he understood intuitively that those images communicated power across every cultural context. He translated that understanding into stage-wear design not to imitate the fashion world but to make the fashion world irrelevant. His goal, stated to his designers plainly, was not to follow what major design houses were producing. It was to produce things that they would subsequently copy. Bush and Tompkins also operated under a framework of 4 principles that governed everything they made. Fit, meaning the garment had to function as a second skin that moved with the choreography rather than against it. Function, meaning nothing could introduce a trip, a slide, or any physical hazard on stage. Fun, meaning space for whimsy drawn from fairy tale and Disney imagery. And first, every design had to be genuinely new. No successful look from a previous tour could be repeated, no matter how enthusiastically audiences had received it. This last constraint kept the wardrobe continuously evolving and prevented any single look from calcifying into uniform. That creative pressure, sustained across a quarter century, is how you generate the breadth of visual invention this collection represents. The glove that was always a tool, the white rhinestone glove, is now so familiar as a cultural symbol that it is easy to forget what it was originally designed to do. The Motown 25 performance in 1983 was a television event filmed for broadcast, meaning the visual environment was controlled lighting against a dark stage. Jackson needed the audience's attention directed precisely to his hand throughout the performance, because the intricate flicks, isolations, and gestures of his choreography carried as much expressive information as his footwork. A single glittering hand against a dark background accomplished this without requiring the audience to consciously track it. The glove drew the eye automatically. The choice to wear only one glove rather than two was a deliberate imbalance. Symmetry is visually satisfying and therefore tends to be ignored. Asymmetry creates a mild unease, a sense that something requires resolution, that keeps the eye returning to the source of the imbalance. One glove on one hand made you keep looking at that hand. The choreography justified every time you looked. Multiple versions were produced across his career, varying in the density and cut of the crystals depending on the demands of the performance context. Some were heavier, built for visual impact in large stadium settings. Others were lighter, designed for filming where the camera would provide the necessary close-up. The fundamental concept never required revision because it was solving a specific visual problem correctly. At auction after his death, one of those gloves reached a price that sounds excessive for a piece of fabric and some rhinestones until you recognize that it was not actually a piece of fabric and some rhinestones. It was one of the most effective pieces of choreographic equipment ever made. And its auction price reflected what the culture understood about what it had done. What object in performance history do you think occupies an equivalent position, so simple in construction, so specific in function, and so outsized in cultural impact? Leave your answer below. The jacket his mother sewed. The black sequined jacket that Jackson wore for the Motown 25 Moonwalk debut was not produced by a design house or a professional costume shop. Katherine Jackson sewed it herself. The silhouette was deliberately simple, cropped short to allow complete freedom of movement through the shoulders and arms. The design principle here was absence rather than presence. Nothing about the jacket was meant to be seen in isolation. Its entire function was to disappear into the performance while the sequins provided optical information in the television lighting. A performer who needs to glide and stop on a dime cannot wear anything that restricts the shoulders, catches air resistance, or adds drag to an arm movement. The jacket was constructed around the movement first and the aesthetic second. That the defining visual element of what would become a global phenomenon, the look that launched decades of imitation, was made by a mother for her son in a home environment says something about where style actually originates. Not in the design atelier or the trend forecast but in the specific physical requirement of a specific performance. Solved practically by someone who understood the performer's body and what it needed to do. The sequins shimmered under television lighting as he pivoted, the fedora completing the composition, the glove drawing the eye, the loafers delivering the grip the floor required. What looked like a unified creative statement was an engineering solution to multiple specific problems. Assembled from components designed by different people for different reasons, all of which happened to be exactly right at the same moment. The red jacket and the cultural penetration problem. Deborah Nadoolman Landis designed the red leather jacket for the Thriller short film by pulling from 1950s collegiate varsity culture and 1970s punk aesthetics in roughly equal measure. The crimson was deliberately bold, even aggressive, against the film's nighttime setting. The winged shoulders and the black V-shaped trim at the front were architectural decisions made to give Jackson a commanding physical presence in the dance sequences, making his slim build read as larger and more imposing than it would under conventional tailoring. 2 jackets were made for the production. That number makes everything that survived extraordinarily rare. One sold at auction in 2011 for $1.8 million, which is a significant sum for a costume from a music video until you consider what that costume actually accomplished. The Thriller jacket achieved what almost no other single garment in entertainment history has managed. It simultaneously became a Halloween mass-market staple available for $20, a museum piece worth millions. A high-fashion reference point for luxury designers. And a generational touchstone that requires no explanation across every demographic that has interacted with popular culture in the past 4 decades. These 4 categories are normally mutually exclusive. A garment that becomes widely replicated in cheap versions loses its cultural prestige. A museum piece is not a Halloween costume. A fashion reference is not mass-market entertainment. The jacket exists in all four categories simultaneously because it solved a specific visual problem so effectively that every audience at every level of engagement could perceive the solution. The shape worked for the film. The color worked for the character. The construction worked for the choreography. And the overall effect worked as an image independent of any of those contexts. That kind of multi-level function is what separates a great costume from a great look. What the historical research produced. Bush and Tompkins did not look at contemporary fashion when designing for Jackson. They looked at European royal history and the regalia of actual monarchs. And they did so with a systematic rigor that their clients in the fashion industry rarely applied to their own reference work. Jackson would walk through European museums and encounter antique royal costumes behind glass and want to understand how they were made. Not to copy them but to access the physical and visual logic that made them communicate authority across centuries. He was particularly drawn to military uniforms, the way that structured ornamentation could transform a human body into a symbol of command. That interest directly informed the staged jackets that became his signature. Tompkins taught himself to solder and sandblast metal specifically to replicate the construction logic of historical armor and royal crowns. He did not outsource the craft or approximate it with available materials. He learned the actual techniques because the effect he needed required the actual process. The sterling silver crown he eventually made for one production was fabricated from scratch because nothing that existed in the costume market produced the right visual weight and finish. King Henry VIII appears frequently in Bush's descriptions of the design process, specifically the silhouette, the broad shoulder, the cinched waist. The imposing physical scale that royal portraiture required monarchs to project. Jackson's stage jackets translate that silhouette logic into a contemporary theatrical context. He did not look like a monarch playing at being a pop star. He looked like a monarch who happened to be performing, and the distinction is visible in every photograph from those tours. The research trips were not casual sightseeing. They were systematic acquisition of knowledge that had no existing application in the entertainment industry and that Tompkins and Bush had to translate into workable production methods through experimentation and practice. For costumes that made political arguments the most underappreciated dimension of Jackson's wardrobe is how precisely some of the most stripped-down pieces delivered political content through deliberate visual contrast with the elaborate spectacle surrounding them. The plain white button-down and black pants from the black or white video in 1991 removed every trace of royal embellishment, military braiding, and crystalline armor. The decision to do this was not a budget constraint or a stylistic accident. The song's argument was about racial harmony and human equality. And the visual logic demanded that the performer stand among his dancers rather than above them. Anyone could wear a white shirt and black pants. That accessibility was the point. The simplicity carried the message in a way that no elaborate costume could have. The They Don't Care About Us prison uniform directed by Spike Lee in 1996 took this logic further. The choice to wear a plain institutional uniform aligned Jackson's body with the incarcerated and the dispossessed. A direct visual act of solidarity that removed every marker of celebrity distance. Coming from a performer who also wore gold-plated shin guards and pearl-embroidered jackets in the same era, the contrast was not accidental. It was designed to be uncomfortable. The costume removed the icon and left the protest. The tattered shirt from the Earth Song performance at the 1996 World Music Awards moved in a different direction. Using fabric in a state of deterioration to embody the song's environmental subject matter. As the performance built to its climax, the visible fragility of the clothing mirrored the argument the music was making. The garment was the metaphor made physical. The Thriller werewolf transformation completed this range. Rick Baker's full prosthetic application turned the most recognizable face in the world into a monster for the opening sequence of the film. Jackson covered himself completely in the character, suppressing his own image in the service of the narrative. For an artist at his commercial peak, That willingness to erase himself was genuinely unusual and reflected a creative commitment to the vision over the personal brand. Which of these four uses of costume as political or narrative argument do you think was the most effective? It is a genuine question with a defensible answer in multiple directions, and the reasoning is interesting. The engineering behind the spectacle. The thriller jacket that appeared on the Bad World Tour and subsequent productions did not simply light up. It contained 11,000 individually wired bulbs that required 3 engineers to install and a dedicated computer technician operating a remote control system to activate during the performance. None of this was visible to the audience. All of it was essential to what the audience saw. The gravity-defying lean from Smooth Criminal required a shoe containing a heel slot that locked onto a peg mounted flush with the stage surface at the precise moment of the lean. The system had to be engineered to fail gracefully. A missed connection meant Jackson stumbling. So the floor pegs and the shoes had to be mechanically reliable night after night across extended tours. The suit he wore had to accommodate the extreme angle without bunching, tearing, or restricting his movement at any point in the process. Bush described a principle that governed the shoes specifically. Jackson refused to allow his Florsheim loafers to be polished because worn leather gave him grip and polished leather introduced slip risk. A twisted ankle, he explained directly to Bush, would put the entire touring company out of work. When the Captain EO production provided futuristic boots that he could not dance properly in, the solution was to cut out the soles and insert his trusted loafers inside the outer shell so the required aesthetic was achieved without compromising his footing. The beaded jackets were destroyed every night. Jackson tore them off and threw them to the stage floor as part of the finale choreography. The damage was real and the zippers took the worst of it. Bush spent nights between shows repairing mangled hardware so the jacket was performance-ready the following evening. Every audience in every city received the same full physical spectacle because the invisible repair work happened between them. The rule that governed the outer limit of the visual vocabulary was equally precise. If a man in the front row could afford to buy and wear the same thing, the performer had lost something essential. The 18-karat gold plating on the shin guards, the custom-molded metal armor, the bullion embroidery that required hundreds of hours by hand. These details existed specifically to make the distance between stage and audience visible and undeniable. The costumes were not aspirational in the sense of suggesting achievable luxury. They were aspirational in the sense of being genuinely, visibly out of reach. This is the part that tends to get lost when Jackson's wardrobe is discussed purely in terms of fashion history. It was not fashion. It was architecture for a show. Purpose-built for a specific body performing specific movements in specific lighting for an audience that needed to understand they were watching something that had no equivalent anywhere else. Every technical decision served that understanding. The detail that belongs to no auction. When Michael Jackson was buried, the designers who had spent 25 years building his visual language sewed a Tinkerbell figure into the lining of his burial jacket. That detail was not for the audience. It was not for press coverage or posthumous documentation. It was a private act between the people who dressed a performer for a quarter-century and the performer himself. The Tinkerbell was a reference to the magic they had been asked to produce consistently across hundreds of costumes, thousands of performances. And a visual legacy that still circulates actively through the culture. The costumes themselves are dispersed now across museums, private collections, and auction houses. The red thriller jacket exists in at least one museum with security appropriate to its assessed value. The white glove has been bid up to figures that reflect decades of cultural embedding. The gold history bodysuit has become a photographic monument as durable as the monument it was designed to resemble. But the Tinkerbell belongs to none of these contexts. It is inside a jacket that is buried. It served its purpose, not as spectacle or symbol or museum artifact, but as a final piece of communication between craftspeople and the person they made things for. The wardrobe outlasts the wearer. That is true of almost every significant clothing collection in history. What is unusual about this one is the degree to which the intention behind each piece remains legible. You can look at the prison uniform and understand the decision. You can look at the tattered shirt and understand the decision. You can look at the crystal-encrusted military jacket and trace the reasoning from King Henry VIII to Liberace to the stage of a stadium and arrive exactly where Bush and Tompkins arrived. At something that had never existed before and that communicated exactly what it was designed to communicate to every person who saw it. That degree of intentionality, sustained across 25 years and 100 different contexts, is what made this not a collection of costumes but a language. And like all durable languages, it keeps being used, keeps being quoted, keeps being referenced by people who were not alive when any of it was first made. What part of this wardrobe do you think has had the most lasting influence on visual performance culture? Not just in music but across theater, film, and live performance? Drop your answer in the comments. The range of what this collection touched is wider than it initially appears. And the conversation about it is worth having with people who have thought about it from different angles.